Somewhere around 3,000 years ago, according to the biblical account, the descendants of a single patriarch named Jacob split into 12 distinct tribes, each one tracing its lineage back to one of Jacob's 12 sons. For centuries, those tribes lived, farmed, fought, and worshipped as separate but related nations, occupying the land of ancient Israel. Then history did what history has always done to smaller nations, caught between larger empires. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and deported large portions of its population, scattering 10 of the 12 tribes so thoroughly across the ancient Near East that they never reassembled as identifiable groups again. A little over a century later, the Babylonian Empire conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, home to the remaining 2 tribes. It carried much of its population into exile as well, though this time, crucially, the exiles eventually returned and reconstituted a distinct national and religious identity in the land they had been taken from. That single historical difference between a population that was scattered and never reconsolidated and a population that was scattered and did eventually return is the entire reason the phrase "the 10 lost tribes of Israel" exists, and it is the entire reason that almost every family name a person might casually associate with those 10 missing tribes belongs firmly in the category of legend rather than documented genealogy. The 2 tribes that did return, Judah and Levi, are the ancestors of essentially every Jewish person alive today, and it is specifically within one of those 2 surviving tribes, Levi, that the only genuinely documented surname-linked, DNA-supported tribal lineage in all of Jewish genealogy survives into the present day. This is worth saying plainly and upfront, because the honest version of this story is considerably more interesting than the version that shows up in most viral genealogy content. There is no reliable surname. Evidence connecting any modern family to the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, or Manasseh. Those 10 tribes are called lost for a reason. The historical and genetic trail genuinely goes cold. Various communities around the world, including the Pashtun tribes of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Bnei Menashe of northeastern India, the Lemba people of southern Africa, and adherents of the British Israelism movement in Britain and its former colonies, have at different points claimed descent from one or another of the lost 10 tribes. And these claims deserve to be treated with real intellectual honesty rather than either uncritical acceptance or dismissive mockery. Some of them, like the Lembas claim, have drawn serious, credentialed genetic researchers precisely because the community's own oral tradition of Israelite priestly descent turned out to correlate with an unexpectedly high frequency of the same Y chromosome marker found in documented Jewish Kohanim, a finding published in respected peer-reviewed genetics journals that surprised even the researchers who conducted it. Others, particularly British Israelism, rest on considerably thinner historical and linguistic evidence and are generally regarded by historians and geneticists as unsupported. But in no case, including the Lemba, does the evidence take the form of a specific family surname that reliably marks descent from one of the 10 scattered tribes. The lost tribes are lost specifically because that kind of documentary and genealogical continuity is exactly what didn't survive. Each of these communities illustrates a slightly different version of the same underlying pattern. The Bnei Menashe, a community of several thousand people from India's northeastern border states, developed a tradition in the 20th century identifying themselves as descendants of the tribe of Manasseh, based on oral histories, ritual practices, and linguistic parallels that community leaders and some outside researchers argue echo ancient Israelite custom. That claim has been taken seriously enough that the Israeli rabbinate has, at various points, recognized segments of the community for the purposes of religious conversion and immigration, but even the most sympathetic outside researchers treat this as a case of a community's own reconstructed identity and religious conversion process, not as a case where a genetic test or a family surname independently proved an unbroken 3,000-year lineage back to the biblical tribe of Manasseh specifically. The Pashtun tribes of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region have long carried their own oral traditions, some tribal names bearing a resemblance to the names of the lost tribes, and some scholars have taken these traditions seriously enough to study them formally, but rigorous historical and genetic work in this area remains limited and inconclusive, and no reputable geneticist has claimed to have identified a Pashtun surname or genetic marker that definitively traces to a specific lost tribe. British Israelism, by contrast, is a 19th century religious and nationalist movement holding that the peoples of Britain and, in some versions, other northern European nations descend from the lost tribes of Israel. This theory has been extensively examined by historians and linguists and has not held up. And it is worth noting plainly that some later offshoots of the movement have taken on explicitly anti-Semitic and racially exclusionary forms that bear little resemblance to genuine historical inquiry. What did survive, against genuinely remarkable odds, is the priestly and Levitical lineage of the tribe of Levi. And the story of how modern genetics actually confirmed that survival, using nothing more than a swab of cheek cells and a research question that could have gone nowhere, is one of the more quietly astonishing findings in the entire field of population genetics. Within the tribe of Levi, Jewish tradition preserves a further, more specific lineage. The descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was appointed by biblical account as the first high priest, and whose male descendants were designated as Kohanim, the hereditary priestly caste responsible for temple service in ancient Israel. Unlike general Jewish identity, which has been passed down matrilineally through the mother's line since roughly the 1st century CE, status as a Cohen has always been passed patrilineally, from father to son, in an unbroken chain that Jewish tradition holds has continued from Aaron himself down to Kohanim living today, roughly 3,000 years and well over 100 generations later. For most of Jewish history, that claim rested entirely on tradition, communal memory, and religious practice, with no way to test it independently. That changed in 1997, when geneticist Karl Skarecki and a team of collaborators published a study in the journal Nature, examining the Y chromosomes of men who identified as Kohanim, drawn from both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish communities that had been geographically and culturally separated from each other for roughly 1,000 years. What they found was startling. Kohanim showed a distinct probability distribution for specific Y chromosome markers compared to the rest of the Jewish population. And this pattern was shared by both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Kohanim, pointing toward a common origin predating the diaspora that followed the destruction of the Second Temple. A follow-up study expanded the genetic markers under examination, and researchers found that a specific array of 6 chromosomal markers appeared in the overwhelming majority of the Cohens they tested, a pattern that came to be known as the Cohen modal. Haplotype, described as the standard genetic signature of the Jewish priestly family, with the odds of this pattern arising purely by chance calculated at less than 1 in 10,000. Because that same genetic signature turned up in both the Ashkenazi Jewish communities of Eastern Europe and the Sephardic Jewish communities of the Mediterranean and Middle East, too, populations that had lived apart from each other, marrying almost entirely within their own communities. For roughly a millennium, the simplest and most widely accepted explanation is that the shared marker predates that 1,000-year split entirely, reaching back to a common paternal ancestor in the ancient Near East, exactly where Jewish tradition places Aaron and the founding of the priesthood. Later, more sophisticated genetic research has added important nuance without overturning the core finding. A 2025 reanalysis using full Y chromosome sequencing rather than the more limited marker sets available in 1997 found that the Kohanim actually descend from several distinct paternal lineages rather than one single ancestor, with the 2 largest documented branches estimated to have diverged from a common Near Eastern origin roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, a time depth broadly consistent with the biblical chronology of Aaron and the founding of the priesthood, even though it complicates the simplest possible version of the story in which every Cohen shares one identical direct male ancestor. Researchers conducting the newer analysis were also careful to only sample Kohanim who could document that their fathers and grandfathers before them had also actively practiced the specific customs of the priestly role, strengthening confidence that the genetic patterns being studied reflect genuine multi-generational priestly tradition rather than a broader coincidence. A parallel investigation into Levites, the broader tribe of Levi from which the Kohanim descend as one specific priestly sublineage, produced a genuinely different and equally interesting result. Rather than one dominant shared marker, researchers found multiple distinct genetic signatures among self-identified Levites, suggesting that the Levite lineage, unlike the narrower Cohen priestly line, was reconstituted from multiple independent paternal origins over the centuries. Notably, one specific marker turned up in more than half of Ashkenazi Levite men tested, and that marker belongs to a genetic haplogroup typical of Eastern Europe rather than the Near East, suggesting that at some point, likely within roughly the last 2,000 years, a substantial number of Ashkenazi Jewish families claiming Levite status descend from a common ancestor who was not of Near Eastern origin, a finding that has generated its own fascinating and still not fully resolved historical questions about how Levite status was transmitted, adopted, or reassigned within specific Ashkenazi communities during the medieval period. Every name on the list below descends through documented Jewish naming tradition, religious status, and in several cases, confirmed genetic testing from either the Cohen priestly lineage or the broader Levite tribal line. That is not a coincidence of ancient record-keeping. It's the direct result of the fact that Cohen and Levite status carried real ongoing religious significance throughout Jewish history, long after the biblical tribal system as a whole had dissolved into general Jewish identity. Kohanim were called first to read from the Torah in synagogue services, recited a specific priestly blessing over the congregation, and were bound by specific religious restrictions, including limits on whom they could marry and prohibitions on contact with the dead that had to be actively maintained and passed down for the status to mean anything at all. Levites, one rung below the Kohanim in ceremonial rank, were called second to the Torah and held specific ceremonial roles connected to the ancient temple service. Because these were living, functioning religious roles rather than dormant ancestral trivia, families had a continuous, practical reason to remember and transmit Cohen or Levite status across generations in a way that no family had any comparable reason to. Remember whether a distant ancestor happened to belong to the tribe of Zebulun or Naphtali. When European Jewish communities were required, generally in the late 18th and early 19th centuries under decrees issued by the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian empires, to adopt fixed hereditary surnames for the first time, many Cohen and Levite families chose or were assigned surnames that directly and permanently marked that status, cementing it into the historical record in a way that has made it traceable by genealogists and geneticists more than 2 centuries later. Cohen is the most direct and unambiguous surname marker of priestly descent in the entire Jewish naming tradition, simply transliterating the Hebrew word for priest, Cohen, directly into a family name. Families carrying this surname across Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jewish communities worldwide were disproportionately represented in the original 1997 Cohen modal haplotype study and its subsequent follow-ups, and the surname's transparent, unmistakable meaning has made it both the most recognizable and the most extensively studied entry point into this entire area of genetic and genealogical research. It is also, today, one of the most common Jewish surnames in the world, which means that within any large group of people named Cohen, some will carry a documented, actively maintained priestly tradition passed down through specific religious practice, while others may carry the name simply because an ancestor adopted it during the era of mandatory surname registration without any specific priestly claim behind it, making family-level documentation, rather than the surname alone, the deciding factor in any individual case. Khan and its close variants Kagan and Cohn represent the same underlying priestly claim as Cohen, adapted through the spelling conventions of Yiddish and the various European languages Jewish communities lived among for centuries. Kagan in particular reflects a Slavic-influenced transliteration common among Jewish families from Eastern Europe and Russia, while Cohn reflects German orthographic convention. And genealogists researching Cohen lineage treat all of these spellings as functionally identical markers of the same underlying priestly claim, differing only in how a given regional bureaucracy chose to render the Hebrew sound into its own alphabet. Interestingly, Kagan is also, coincidentally, an unrelated title used historically by rulers of the medieval Khazar Khanate and later Mongol and Turkic states, a coincidence that has occasionally fueled unrelated and largely discredited theories about Ashkenazi Jewish origins tracing to Khazar converts rather than Near Eastern ancestry. Mainstream genetic research, including the Y chromosome, studies discussed throughout this piece, does not support that theory, and the surname Kagan among Jewish families is understood by genealogists to derive from the Hebrew priestly title rather than the unrelated Central Asian royal one. Katz looks, on the surface, like an ordinary German-derived surname, but it is in fact an acronym formed from the Hebrew phrase Kohen Tzedek, meaning righteous priest or priest of righteousness. This kind of acronymic surname, built by compressing a longer Hebrew religious phrase into a single pronounceable word, was a common naming strategy among Ashkenazi Jewish families during the era of mandatory surname adoption, and Katz stands as one of the clearest and most widely recognized examples of the pattern, carrying an explicit priestly claim embedded directly into its etymology, even though the surname itself gives no obvious surface indication of that meaning to anyone unfamiliar with its Hebrew origin. The acronym convention that produced Katz was widespread enough that genealogists researching Ashkenazi Jewish surnames treat it as a distinct and recognizable category of its own, alongside ordinary occupational, geographic, and patronymic surnames, precisely because so many families use the same compression technique to preserve specific religious or genealogical claims inside an otherwise unremarkable-sounding European family name. Azulai represents the Sephardic and North African branch of documented Cohen surnames carried by Jewish families with roots in Morocco and other parts of the Western Mediterranean Jewish diaspora. Its inclusion alongside the more familiar Ashkenazi names on this list is a useful reminder that the Cohen modal haplotype research specifically drew its strongest evidence from the fact that the same genetic marker turned up independently among both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Cohen families, two populations that had been geographically and culturally separated for roughly 1,000 years, which is precisely what makes the shared genetic signature so significant rather than simply a marker of one specific regional Jewish community. Hey Cohen, meaning literally the priest in Hebrew, with a definite article built directly into the name, functions as an even more explicit and formal declaration of priestly status than the simple surname Cohen. It appears more often among families that maintained closer ties to Hebrew language religious practice, including many Israeli families who adopted or restored explicitly Hebrew surnames in the 20th century, and it carries the same underlying claim to Aaronic priestly descent as every other entry on this list, expressed in its most linguistically direct possible form. Kaplan is the one name on this list whose priestly connection is not immediately obvious from its surface meaning, since the word itself derives from the German and Polish term for a chaplain or clergyman's assistant, with no direct Hebrew root at all. Genealogists and historians of Ashkenazi Jewish naming practices have documented that during the eras of mandatory surname adoption in Poland and Lithuania, a number of Cohen families deliberately chose Kaplan specifically because of its close phonetic and conceptual resemblance to their existing religious role, using a local language word for clergyman as a kind of linguistic stand-in for their Hebrew priestly status. Not every family named Kaplan carries this history, since the surname was also adopted by Jewish families with no priestly claim at all simply because it was a common and available option, which makes Kaplan a name where family-specific documentation matters more than it does for a name like Cohen or Katz. Levi and its common variant spelling Levi mark direct descent from the broader tribe of Levi as a whole, one step removed from the specifically Aaronic priestly line carried by Cohen and its variants. Levite families held their own distinct, if slightly lower ceremonial status in traditional Jewish religious practice, called second to read from the Torah after the Kohanim, and historically responsible for musical and other ceremonial duties connected to temple service. And the surname Levi represents one of the oldest and most transparent tribal status surnames in the entire Jewish naming tradition, requiring no acronym or linguistic substitution to convey its meaning. The genetic research into Levite lineage produced a notably different result than the Cohen studies, finding multiple distinct paternal origins rather than one dominant shared ancestor, which fits the historical reality that Levite status, while ceremonially significant, was transmitted through a much larger founding population than the comparatively narrow Aaronic priestly line. Levine functions as an anglicized and Yiddish-inflected extension of the base name Levi, common among Ashkenazi Jewish families, particularly after emigration to English-speaking countries, where the added suffix softened the name's pronunciation for non-Hebrew and non-Yiddish-speaking neighbors, while preserving its underlying tribal claim fully intact. Families carrying this surname trace the same Levite status as those carrying the unmodified name Levi, and genealogists treat the two spellings as directly interchangeable markers of the same underlying lineage claim. The name's popularity in the United States specifically, following waves of Ashkenazi Jewish immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, means that Levine today carries a somewhat different geographic distribution than the base name Levi, concentrated more heavily in American Jewish communities descended from Eastern European immigrants of that specific period. Levitt represents a more direct English transliteration of Levite itself, functioning almost as a title rather than a surname in its most literal reading, and it appears most commonly among Ashkenazi Jewish families with roots in England and other English-speaking regions, where the naming convention took shape somewhat differently than it did in continental Europe. Like Levine, it carries the identical underlying tribal claim as the base name Levi, simply rendered through a different linguistic pathway, and its comparative rarity relative to Levi and Levine makes it one of the more distinctive and easily traceable names on this list for descendants researching a specific family branch. Siegel is, like Katz, an acronym rather than an ordinary word, formed from the Hebrew phrase Segen Levia, meaning deputy or assistant of the Levites. This surname marks a specifically Levite rather than Cohen claim, and its acronymic structure places it alongside Katz as one of the clearest examples of how Ashkenazi Jewish families compressed formal Hebrew religious titles into practical, pronounceable European surnames during the era of mandatory surname adoption, embedding a specific ceremonial tribal claim into a name that, like Katz, gives no obvious surface indication of that meaning to anyone unfamiliar with its Hebrew acronymic origin. Variant spellings including Siegel and Siegel appear in some family lines, generally reflecting the same underlying acronym rendered through slightly different regional spelling conventions. And genealogists researching Levite ancestry typically treat these variants as carrying the same tribal claim as the standard Siegel spelling. If your family carries one of these 10 surnames, you're looking at one of the very few instances in all of human genealogy where a specific surname plausibly connects to a documented 3,000-year-old tribal and religious lineage, supported not just by oral tradition and religious practice, but by independently replicated genetic research spanning multiple studies and multiple decades. That is a genuinely remarkable thing for a family name to carry. and it is worth treating with the seriousness it deserves rather than either inflating it into more certainty than the science actually supports or dismissing it as mere folklore. It's also worth being precise about the limits. Carrying the surname Cohen does not, by itself, guarantee that a genetic test will show the Cohen modal haplotype. Surnames have been changed, adopted for non-hereditary reasons, or assigned inconsistently often enough throughout history that surname and genetic lineage frequently diverge, even within Jewish naming tradition specifically. Conversely, the absence of one of these 10 surnames does not rule out Cohen or Levite ancestry, since Jewish families with confirmed priestly or Levite status have also carried ordinary, unmarked surnames throughout history, particularly in regions or eras where mandatory surname adoption assigned names based on geography, occupation, or simple bureaucratic convenience rather than religious status. And critically, none of this extends to the 10 other tribes of ancient Israel. No surname on any list, however confidently marketed, reliably marks descent from Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Ash, Ar, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, or Manasseh, because the historical and genetic record for those tribes genuinely does not survive in a form that modern research can trace, which is the entire reason they are remembered as lost in the first place. For anyone who does carry one of these 10 surnames and wants to move beyond family tradition towards something more rigorously documented, the practical research path looks similar to any serious genealogical project, with one added option unavailable to most other genealogical questions: direct genetic testing. Y-DNA testing, available through several commercial and academic genealogy services, can compare an individual's paternal line markers against the published Cohen modal haplotype and related priestly and Levite reference panels, offering a genuinely independent line of evidence beyond family tradition or surname alone. Because status as a Cohen or Levite passes strictly through the paternal line, this kind of testing only works meaningfully along an unbroken father-to-son chain. A family with a documented Cohen surname on the maternal side, however proud that heritage might be within the family's own tradition, will not show the associated genetic marker on Y-DNA testing, since Y chromosome inheritance follows only the direct paternal line. Combining Y-DNA results with documented family religious practice, including whether a specific father and grandfather were recorded performing the priestly blessing in synagogue or observing the specific restrictions traditionally placed on Kohanim, gives genealogists the strongest possible combined case, mirroring exactly the standard the 2025 reanalysis of Kohanim lineages applied when selecting participants for its own more rigorous genetic sampling. It is worth sitting with just how unusual this entire situation actually is within the broader landscape of ancestry and genealogy claims. Most surname-based ancestry research, including the Melungeon and crypto-Jewish research discussed in similar studies of American family history, relies on documentary records, oral tradition, and regional history built up over a few centuries at most, with DNA testing serving as a helpful but secondary line of supporting evidence. The Cohen and Levite lineage claims are different in kind, not just in degree. They rest on a specific, actively maintained religious practice that had to be performed and transmitted generation after generation for the status to mean anything at all, stretching back not centuries but millennia through the destruction of the first and second temples, centuries of exile in Babylon, and later dispersal across the Roman world, the medieval formation of separate Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish communities that would not meaningfully reunite for 1,000 years, and finally into the modern genetic laboratories where researchers, testing men, reconstruction, but by an unbroken chain of fathers passing a specific ceremonial role to their sons, generation after generation, through the destruction of 2 temples, 2 millennia of exile and dispersion across nearly every continent on Earth, and the eventual reunion of Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities whose shared genetic marker turned out to prove, more convincingly than any single piece of oral tradition ever could, that some threads of ancient history really do survive intact if you know exactly where, and in whom, to look for them.